Good day.
Today is Sunday, 22nd June 2025, and before I turn to the momentous events of the last 24 hours, I will just briefly say that the internet at my home and in my home area continues to be down. It was supposed to be restored by midnight on Saturday. It has not been restored. I have been given no indication as to when it will be restored. Apparently engineering works are still underway. I'm not being provided with any updates, so the whole situation continues to be up in the air. The result is that I have to depend now increasingly on the hospitality and generosity of my friends, and of course that creates its own difficulties and embarrassments because obviously I cannot trespass indefinitely on their space. So just to say, one effect of this is that though I'm going to continue to provide programs, the duration of these programs may be affected until this underlying problem is resolved. Now, having said that, let's go straight to the events of the last 24 hours. In my program yesterday, I spoke about how various statements and comments that appear to be coming from US officials, including the president himself, appeared to suggest that the administration was leaning towards some kind of negotiated outcome of the conflict with Iran. But I also said that the military moves seemed to argue otherwise. We were getting reports of aircraft carriers, 3 aircraft carriers, 3/4 apparently of the usable carrier fleet being deployed to the area of Iran. There were reports of more positioning of aircraft and refueling aircraft especially in bases close to Iran. And shortly after I made my program, reports began to pour in that B-2 stealth bombers were being redeployed by the United States to Guam in ways that also seemed to suggest that a strike on Iran was imminent. And indeed, and as presumably all of you know, the strike on Iran duly took place in the following hours. And the strike took 2 forms. B-2 stealth bombers operating at very high altitudes, apparently, out of reach, it seems, of Iranian air defenses, conducting strikes against the enrichment facility at Fordow, the one that is buried deep inside the mountain, and I believe also at the site in Natanz. Apparently 14 of the big bunker-busting bombs used in total, or at least that's what some reports say, others put it at less than that. If it really is as many as 14, then that uses up around 2/3 of the inventory of these big bunker-busting bombs, just saying. But anyway, huge bunker-busting bombs. The largest number dropped on the facility in Fordow, but some of them apparently also dropped on Natanz, and strikes with Tomahawk cruise missiles against all 3 facilities, 3 big Iranian nuclear facilities, the ones at Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Now, there are enormously conflicting claims as to the damage that these attacks have done. The United States, the president himself, says that the attacks have been completely successful. He speaks about all 3 sites having been completely obliterated. I have seen no information or evidence so far that confirms those claims. They may be true, they may be untrue, but that at least is what the president is saying, and that is what other US officials are saying also. Iranian officials are saying something completely different. They speak mostly, I notice, about the facility at Fordow. They are saying that the entrance and exit points of the facility did take severe damage, but most of the facility, located deep inside the mountain, is either undamaged or damaged in a way that can be repaired. That's what the Iranians are saying. And indeed, the Iranians are suggesting that all three facilities have taken damage, but that none of them has been completely destroyed. Now, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, has given a press conference in Istanbul in which he too has said that the facilities have been damaged, but he seemed to be saying that a full assessment of the damage has not yet been done and that we can't say definitely how extensive the damage is. So either the facilities have been destroyed, as the Americans claim, or they have been damaged, but perhaps can be brought back into a state of repair, as the Iranians claim. We're likely to get a full briefing from the United States later today. I am going to suggest that neither side at the moment has a full picture. The Iranians probably have not been able to enter and explore what has happened to the lower facilities, the deep inside Fordow, and the Americans can only have limited information about what has happened to a facility that is located far underground. Indeed, I remember reading reports, I think it was in the Financial Times, that in order for the United States to establish confidently what the effect on the strike on Fordow has actually been, the United States would need to deploy ground forces at Fordow itself to inspect the facilities there, and of course that is out of the question. So I'm going to suggest that nobody really knows, and it's impossible for anybody to say with confidence at this time, and anybody who's making confident assertions one way or the other is probably saying more than they actually know. Satellite photos of any one of these facilities as of the timing of making of this program have not appeared. I have said many times that I am the last person on earth to be able to assess satellite photos with any confidence. I can barely see them, and even if I could see them more clearly, I'm hardly the right person to assess bomb damage of any facility. But maybe by tomorrow or over the course of the next few days, we will have a clear understanding of what this attack has actually accomplished. Now, there are a few further things to say as I make this program. And the first is an absolutely astonishing piece of information provided by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have said that there is no evidence of any radioactive leakage from any one of these facilities because the Iranians evacuated all relevant personnel from the facilities some days ago. That I would have anyway assumed, but that they also removed all of the enriched uranium from the facilities and apparently other essential equipment as well, and that this enriched uranium and these facilities have been hidden away in secret sites which even the International Atomic Energy Agency apparently doesn't know about. Now, some days ago, an Iranian official, a senior Iranian official, said exactly the same thing. And I didn't take it particularly seriously. I don't know how bulky this enriched uranium that Iran has actually is. It seemed to me that it was the kind of thing that the Iranians might be expected to say, but I didn't think it was a reliable claim. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which has presumably known this all along, but sat on this information before the American strike, has now confirmed that what the Iranian official said is actually true. So it seems that whatever the United States thought it was doing when it attacked Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan, it has not destroyed or damaged or dispersed the enriched uranium. Now, maybe that is an entirely good thing. If the enriched uranium were dispersed into the atmosphere, I assume that we would be looking at a catastrophic situation. Perhaps if it was located in caverns far underground beneath Fordow, the bomb damage might have sealed it in, but it doesn't seem as if this has happened. It seems that Iran still has its stockpile of enriched uranium. We don't know where it is. And of course, the Iranians, quite plausibly, if they have established alternative sites for their enriched uranium, they might even have established alternative sites where they could resume their enrichment facilities. And that's always assuming that the site on Fordow and Natanz and Esfahan was successful and that the centrifuges located in these locations have indeed been damaged or destroyed. We simply don't know. So all of this again begs the question of what exactly has been actually achieved by this attack. If the enriched uranium stockpile is still accessible to Iran and is still in its possession, if the technicians are still available, well, the Iranians have already shown their ability to build centrifuges. They rebuilt the centrifuges that they destroyed after the 2015 JCPOA. Obviously, they're under attack at the present time by Israel and the United States, but they have an enormous country. They can establish scattered facilities, perhaps in many locations. It's possible that they could resume enrichment again. It's possible that they have already done so. It may be that they can adapt the enriched uranium they already possess through whatever technologies or facilities is still available to them and build the 15 nuclear weapons out of that enriched uranium that people have already previously been saying, Iran might be in a position to do. So, again, I do wonder about the logic or purpose of this attack, at least from an American point of view. If the real objective was to destroy Iran's nuclear program, it might have disrupted it. It doesn't seem as if it has stopped it. Now, there is another possibility, which I'm not going to say that I know anything about, but I've already discussed in previous programs that the Russians have at various times suggested that they might be willing to act as custodians of Iran's enriched uranium. Maybe when the Iranians say that they've removed it to a secret facility, that facility might not be in Iran at all. Could it be in Russia? Might it in fact be in China? Might all those mysterious aircraft flights from China be all about that? Might it be the case that the Iranians have some kind of arrangement with China to move their enriched facilities to China? We're not going to get any confirmation of this. And for the record, given how deeply suspicious the Iranians are of pretty much everybody, I doubt that Iran, minus a clear and open agreement, would part with its enriched uranium. But to repeat again, as of today, we just don't know. Now, what are the consequences going to be of all of this? And how did we get here? Let's deal with the second first. There's already been much discussion about the role that the United States has played in the original Israeli attack on Iran. The United States has admitted to foreknowledge of the Israeli attack. It had the ability to prevent the attack from being launched, but it didn't exercise it. There's been much discussion about the level of duplicity that the President of the United States, Donald Trump himself, showed in advance of the attack. Many people, myself being one of them, have felt more probably that Trump has been swept along by events rather than being in control of them. I still get the impression that that is true. The reports that I'm seeing coming out of the United States, or at least the media in the United States and from US officials, if they are to be taken seriously, and that is a huge if, speak of continued dissension and argument within the administration. There was a fascinating article in Reuters, I think it was Reuters, which spoke of bitter arguments between US officials, with the hardliners steadily winning the argument for the president's ear. The Israelis apparently very unhappy by Donald Trump's suggestion that he might postpone an attack on Iran for 2 weeks in order to see whether there was a possibility of negotiations. The Israelis said that they couldn't wait for those 2 weeks. That begs the question of why the Israelis couldn't wait for the 2 weeks. Personally, I don't think it's difficult to explain that. We've already had reports from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post that Israel is running out of air defense interceptors. We've had further confirmation over the course of the last 24 hours that there are gaps in the Israeli air defense system, that Iranian missiles are able to hit targets inside Israel. And my own sense is that the reason for the Israeli urgency is that they were worried that in 2 weeks' time, if there'd not been an American attack, Israel's situation would have deteriorated because of the shortage of air defense interceptors and the balance of advantage in the missile war, the attrition war, would have gone decisively in favor and visibly in favor of Iran. So this is probably why the Israelis were lobbying so heavily for an immediate strike upon Iran. At least, if you believe the reports, that is what they were doing. There was another report on Reuters which spoke of a furious row between officials of John Radcliffe, the CIA director, and the commander of CENTCOM, that's the American military officer who's in command of US forces in the Middle East, that they supposedly have become spokespeople for Mossad, has been described. Some US officials have described it, that they've been constantly talking about how the regime in Iran is brittle. They've apparently been downplaying the significance of the enrichment facilities, but have been focusing again on trying to get strikes on Iran with a view to facilitating regime change in that country. Anyway, there's supposedly been rows involving Radcliffe and the US general, with the Israelis involved, and other US officials who have been more skeptical have been supposedly pushing back and have been saying that the briefings that are coming out of Israel are aggressive and over the top and are not supported by independent corroboration and evidence. And lastly, there was another report, definitely from Reuters, which spoke of a row between Israeli officials and the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, in which Vance is supposed to have told the Israeli officials that Israel was trying to lead the United States into a war in the Middle East, a war which was not in America's interest. For the record, that is the one report I lend the greatest credence to. I don't know for a fact that it happened, that the exchange between Vance and the Israelis really was of that kind, but it would be consistent with what is known of Vance's opinions and the kind of things he has been saying in the past. But anyway, there are all of these reports circulating of bitter arguments and bitter rows. You can believe them or not, as you choose. The point is, ultimately, it all makes very little difference as far as the Iranians are concerned, or perhaps I should correct that. It makes no difference as far as the Iranians are concerned. Either the United States the administration is divided and the president himself is a ditherer, but cannot control his Israeli ally and is being pulled along in Prime Minister Netanyahu's wake, or he is a duplicitous and treacherous individual who conspires to attack Iran. But one way or the other, as far as the Iranians are concerned, the president and his administration are no longer people that they can negotiate with. Going back to that press conference that the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has given, he has said that the United States blew up the negotiating table. It is Israel and the United States blew up the negotiating table. The negotiations, which appeared to be going well, were underway between the United States and Iran. Araghchi himself had had successful and friendly meetings with the US's chief negotiator, Chief Steve Witkoff. And from an Iranian point of view, whether the attack on Iran is the product of chaos and America being pulled along in Israel's wake, or whether it was a treacherous operation planned by the United States all along, from an Iranian point of view, it makes no difference. The outcome is the same. The United States has attacked Iran in the middle of negotiations, and the Iranians have no reason to trust the United States anymore. In fact, as Araghchi straightforwardly said, they cannot trust the United States anymore. So, that then brings us to what happens next. Now, if you go to the reports in the United States today, if you look at the president's own statements, and there does seem to be a clearly defensive tone to some of these statements, it's quite clear that the Americans, the president himself, hopes, and I think hopes is the right word, that this attack on the nuclear facilities in Iran will be the end of the affair. He's actually said that this is the point where the Iranians need to agree to a ceasefire and to start negotiations. It's very interesting, incidentally, that the United States and the Europeans, ever since the Israeli attack on Iran on the 12th of June, the 13th of June, have been saying that the Iranians needed to continue the negotiations. I've even heard a report that Trump was apparently astonished when, after the Israeli attack, the Iranians didn't call him and beg for negotiations. I've heard this said. I don't know whether it's true or not. But anyway, the Americans and the Europeans have been calling for Iran to negotiate, even as Israel attacks Iran. They've not been saying that Israel should cease its attacks on Iran to enable negotiations to take place. Anyway, they've been making that demand, which of course is completely contrary to what they've been saying about the situation in Ukraine. There they have been saying, they've been arguing for months, that first there should be a ceasefire and only then negotiations. Now in the attack, after the attack by Israel on Iran, they're saying negotiations first and ceasefire afterwards. Simplicius the thinker has a really good point about, makes a really good discussion about this on his latest Substack post, in which he said that the contradictions and the hypocrisies on this are stark and obvious, and by the way, never discussed by anybody in the media in the West. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Now the president, having carried out his attack on the nuclear sites, and his officials are apparently saying, well, we've carried out this strike. This is the only strike we want to attack. We don't want to attack Iran anymore. We will attack Iran if Iran attacks US facilities and US bases, but we don't want to do it. We want to stop now. Now, after we've destroyed their sites, the Iranians can come and negotiate and presumably capitulate to our demands. What, however, if the Iranians do no such thing? After all, they still have their stockpile of enriched uranium. They may still have their centrifuges. They may be able to resume enrichment of nuclear material. We don't know. They might be able to work on the material they have towards developing a nuclear bomb. Or maybe they will start to take countermeasures. Maybe even if the president wants to stop this conflict with the Iranians are not interested in doing so. Maybe the Iranians, having been attacked in this way, having decided that the United States is not a party that they can negotiate with, maybe the Iranians, sensing perhaps that in the attrition war with Israel, they are in a position of advantage, will say, well, whatever the Americans think they've achieved by these attacks on our nuclear sites, our priority should be to force the Israelis into concessions by continuing our attacks on Israel. And perhaps the Iranians also will not show the discipline and composure and self-restraint that the Russians have shown. Maybe these Iranians will now conduct attacks on American bases across the Middle East, which they are clearly capable of doing, as their missile strikes on Israel have shown. Moreover, as I've been making this program, there are some rather concerning reports circulating that the IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has begun mining the Straits of Hormuz in order supposedly to prevent ships, tankers exiting the Persian Gulf. If that report is true, then certainly we will see a surge in oil prices, it seems to me. And of course, what does the United States do in that case? Does it try to open the Straits of Hormuz? Does it deploy warships in the area to try and do that, to demine the straits? We've seen with the Houthis in the Red Sea that even when the United States tries to reopen sea lanes which are being blocked by the Houthis are able to continue to strike on shipping and to attack American warships. What if the United States finds that it's facing the same problem with the Iranians? Does it undertake a ground operation? What exactly does it do? One of the great problems with conducting strikes like the one that the United States has just conducted against Iran, and then saying that you want to call it a day, is that depends entirely on whether the other side agrees with you. What Iran does not want to call it a day. What if Iran feels that it is obliged to hit back? Or what if Iran also feels that it has no incentive not to hit back because it cannot count on further strikes not being conducted against it in the future? What if Iran decides that it needs to hit back against Israel and potentially the United States and to close the Gulf of Hormuz because it needs to reassert deterrence and show strength, because only on that basis can it hope to achieve a negotiated outcome which would be beneficial to itself. In that case, the United States is going to face a potential protracted conflict with Iran. And I've already said that this is not something that is at all in Israel's interests or the United States' interests. I am going to say something which I think I can speak of with confidence. If Iranian missile strikes on Israel continue over the next couple of weeks, then as night follows day, Israel is going to start asking the United States to join Israel in further strikes against Iran. It is unavoidable. And at that point, we would probably start to see ourselves drawn into a protracted conflict. It is very, very easy to say, I'm going to conduct one strike and then I stop, but it might be impossible to do because the moment you start conducting strikes, you lose control, potentially, of the whole situation. So anyway, these are the issues and problems that the United States is facing. The Iranians obviously have to make their own calculations. I would have thought myself that it is not in Iran's interests to conduct missile strikes against American bases. That would oblige the United States to retaliate. I am not sure myself that it is in Iran's interests to block the Straits of Hormuz at this time, but be aware that there are reports that Iran is doing that very thing. And of course, I am not making Iran's decisions, but I can very easily see why the Iranians might conclude that it is indeed in their interests to continue their missile strikes against Israel, because they know that they can probably withstand a long war. They withstood a long war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1980s, and they probably calculate correctly that the United States and Israel cannot do the same thing. So time works in Iran's advantage, and given that Iran probably does feel that it needs to reassert its capabilities and its deterrence, I can absolutely see why they might at this time decide to opt for an attrition war, and that logically points to continued missile strikes by Iran against Israel. I don't get the sense that this has been thought through properly in the United States or in Israel either. A pattern of decision making which is either conducted cynically and in secret without widespread consultations within the entire American political system, or in the alternative, a pattern of decision making which is made in the context of rows and conflicts and anger and raised voices. Neither pattern of decision making that I've described is conducive to cool calculations of the sort that would be needed ahead of war, of starting a war. It may be that though the Americans think and hope and believe that they have finished with Iran, they have failed to realize that Iran has not finished with them. Anyway, let's see what happens. Now, Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, says that he's now going to go to Moscow tomorrow and he's going to meet with Putin. And he has been speaking of Russia as Iran's friend. And of course, Putin has been very outspoken about what has happened. And he has quite clearly qualified the Israeli attack on Iran as an act of aggression. And the Russian Foreign Ministry today has published an extremely strong statement, also saying that they unequivocally condemn the American strike on Iran. And worryingly, but correctly, the Russians say that what has just been done has been a massive blow against the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and the International Atomic Energy Agency and its credibility. Iran, after all that has happened, no longer has any further grounds to cooperate with the IAEA. It no longer has confidence. It's made it absolutely clear that it no longer has confidence in its director, Rafael Grossi. Neither do the Russians, by the way. Both the Russians and the Iranians have long since concluded that Grossi acts essentially as an agent of the State Department. The Russians have been furious over Grossi's endless prevarications as to who is attacking the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And the Iranians clearly believe, undoubtedly correctly, that the IAEA has been passing secret information about their nuclear facilities to the United States and played an instrumental role in providing the fig leaf justification for the Israeli attack by dredging up actions that the Iranians took 20 years ago and getting the board of the IAEA to pass a resolution that was critical of Iran and which Israel and the US seized on in order to justify the attacks that they have conducted. So the Russians are absolutely right. They're saying that the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is now in crisis, and the IAEA, the agency that was once relied upon to enforce the non-proliferation treaty, has had its credibility destroyed. The Russians appear to believe that Iran potentially could move forward now with a nuclear weapons program. Whilst it had not done so previously, it might be willing to do that now. Now, the Russians do not want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. I don't think any of the events of the last week or of the last 24 hours have changed that calculus at all. But what can the Russians do? Well, actually quite a lot. They can continue to provide Iran with economic and assistance, gas and food and other things in order to keep the Iranian economy functioning. For the record, the Iranians have been saying that after the initial strikes, the Israeli strikes on Tehran, the situation in the city has stabilized and economic activity has resumed, and that the Chamber of Guilds in Tehran has basically said that economic activity in Tehran can resume. That is contradicted by other claims, which say that half the population of Tehran, 5 million people, have fled the city. I don't believe those claims, by the way. I think the Iranian claims about economic stabilization are more likely true, because contrary to what many are saying, my overall impression is that Israeli airstrikes on Tehran and on other locations in Iran have been gradually slackening. So, anyway, whatever the truth of that, and I accept these are impressions, even if Iran now comes under a prolonged bombing offensive involving both Israel and the United States, the Russians probably do have the means to ensure that economic life continues in Iran in some form. Bear in mind what I've said already. It is an enormous country. It has mountains and locations which are probably difficult to bomb in themselves. Obviously, there are major cities which can be bombed. I think if Israel and the United States start bombing cities, that is going to create a revulsion of feeling against the United States and Israel around the world, just to say, conceivably within the United States itself. But anyway, the point is that the Russians have the means to mitigate at least the effects of that. Of course, the Russians can do other things. They can provide intelligence. They can start quietly providing Iran with weapons, air defense weapons, and things of that kind. And the longer the war goes on, the more of that the Russians can do. China is the same. The Chinese can also do the same things. I think myself, however, that the first thing that the Russians are going to try to do when Arakshi arrives in Moscow on Monday is that they will say to him, Russia will support Iran, but that it does not want Iran to escalate the situation by taking extreme steps, such as attacking American bases and facilities across the Middle East, or oil installations in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. And I think that the Russians will also probably advise against a blockade of the Straits of Hormuz, though that, of course, may have already happened. And the Russians will probably, again, advise the Iranians on their negotiating strategy, though it will be one which, judging by what the Iranians themselves are saying, it could be that the Iranians, anyway, are prepared to give up on. So anyway, we will see. The meeting between Putin and Arakshi tomorrow is going to be extremely interesting. We will no doubt have a long Russian readout, setting up what the Russians are advising the Iranians. If we get a short readout, or no readout at all, by the way, then that could be a sign that the Russians are going to start taking further steps that they don't want to disclose, such as perhaps providing some form of military support, though I don't myself expect at this stage that will happen. Give it weeks, give it months, and the calculus will change. And of course, Putin and Xi Jinping spoke to each other a couple of days ago, 2 days ago. We can be sure that in advance of Arakshi's trip to Moscow, Putin and Xi Jinping or their officials will also be again in contact with each other. And after Putin has spoken to Arakshi, Putin will probably want to speak to Xi Jinping all over again, though it is unlikely after he does that we will get confirmation of that or a Russian readout most contacts between Russian and Chinese leaders being conducted in private. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the overall situation at the moment. Getting a sense, as I said, of the zany way in which this whole thing has been conducted and the astonishing claims that one hears. There are reports also circulating that President Trump, in a last desperate bid to avoid the strike on Iran, apparently tried to get negotiations up and running with the Iranians in Istanbul. He was supposedly in contact with President Erdogan of Turkey to get those negotiations going. Apparently, President Trump wanted Khamenei himself to come to Istanbul, and apparently he even offered to go to Istanbul himself. But supposedly, the Iranians were themselves unable to get through to Khamenei himself in order to obtain his confirmation. I don't believe the last claim, by the way. I am sure that the Iranians have a way of consulting their very own supreme leader. I go back to what Eve Smith said to me a few days ago in an email that she sent. This is before the latest American strike on Iran. What senior Iranian official in their senses would want to travel and meet with American officials now, given the assassination spree that the Israelis have been under? It's a wonder that Arakshi himself is doing so, but then of course he is the foreign minister of Iran. If we're talking about the supreme leader of Iran, well, the Americans and the Israelis have already spoken of their desire to kill him. At least the Israelis have been absolutely forthright about this. So it would be absolute idiotic folly for Khamenei to leave whatever secret location he is in at the moment, to make himself visible and to travel to Istanbul. Even if Donald Trump himself were to give Khamenei an absolute categorical assurance of safe conduct, how could Khamenei rely upon it? I don't know whether in the United States they understand yet, at least in the administration, the damage that this affair has done. I suspect that we are indeed now in the opening stages of a protracted war in the Middle East. It could be that, like many of these wars, there are periods of intensity and periods of abatement. It might be that there are not strikes and attacks taking place every day. But let's assume that I am right and that there is a protracted war and that the Iranians continue to launch strikes, missile strikes against Israel. The United States will have to launch counterstrikes against Iran. Israel has only limited capacity to continue to hit targets against Iran. That means that the United States is going to have to keep much of its fleet, 3 aircraft carriers at the moment, permanently based in locations around Iran. It's going to have to send more of its air defense interceptors to try to protect its bases from potential Iranian attacks. Because even if Iran at the moment has no incentive, no logical incentive to attack American bases, if the Americans, at the urging of the Israelis, attack Iran, regardless, that Iranian calculus could also change. If this becomes protracted, the United States will be bogged down in another forever war in the Middle East against the most powerful military power in the Middle East. And of course, its navy, as I said, will be trapped in that conflict. Its forces will be trapped in that conflict. For the moment, there is no talk about a ground war against Iran. But of course, if the conflict becomes protracted, maybe voices suggesting that very thing will start to appear, which would of course be another disaster for the United States were that to happen, because a ground war against Iran on Iranian territory would be, I suspect, a complete nightmare, given the size and geography of the country. But anyway, one could see how the United States is maneuvering itself into an indefinite conflict, even as US officials, people like Elbridge Colby, repeatedly speak about the importance of focusing instead on the Indo-Pacific region. And other US officials, including the president himself, have promised the American people and their electoral base that the United States will not be involved in any more forever wars in the Middle East. I have to say, speaking today, I don't get any sense again that any of this has been thought through. I'm still incredulous that an agreement with Iran, which was there on the table, there were issues to be resolved, undoubtedly. There were problems of timing and synchronization, but they were there, that all of that was thrown away, and we've embarked now on this extraordinary, reckless adventure with no clear exit strategy and no visible end in sight. Anyway, there it is. We will see what happens. Maybe, contrary to my expectations, some kind of ceasefire and negotiation does take place over the next couple of weeks. If it doesn't, as I said, we're in serious trouble. I hope that the reports that the Straits of Hormuz have been blockaded are wrong, but the consistent story over the last week is that one's worst fears are consistently realized. And it could be, as I said, it seems to me much more likely that we are looking at a long, wearisome struggle, prolonged struggle, which will again sap the power of the United States, weaken its economy, ultimately, create more fissures within its own society, and which will ultimately play to the advantage of its Eurasian adversaries. There it is. Anyway, let me just add one further point here, which is that, of course, and this goes back to the fact that the B-2 bombers were able to strike at Fordow and, I believe, Natanz without any interference from the Iranian air defences, if they even exist. It's become absolutely clear to me over the last week that Larry Johnson's assessment is completely true. Neither Iran nor Israel have air defences that remotely live up to the claims that were made about them prior to the start of this conflict. Again, there is a massive unwillingness on the Israeli side to admit to this, but it's clear to me that the Iron Dome and the Arrow and David's Sling and all of those are full of holes. I suspect the problem is not so much technological as conceptual, that Israel simply does not have the long experience that Russia has in creating integrated air defense systems. And the result was that an air defense system has been created in Israel, which is not anywhere near as effective as the Israelis perhaps assumed it was. And as for Iran, it seems to me that their air defense system has been shown to be as fragmented and as disorganized as those of every other important country in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Bashar al-Assad's Syria, all of them. None of them have functioned with the efficiency that Russia does, that Ukraine did, or that the former Yugoslavia showed during the NATO bombing war of 1999. Of course, Russia, Ukraine, and to a very great extent Yugoslavia were all beneficiaries of Soviet developments in developing air defense systems, which extend back to the early 1950s and in some cases to the early 1940s. No other country has devoted time and effort and attention to developing an integrated air defense system on the scale that first the Soviet Union and then Russia has done. Clearly, Iran has proved incapable of replicating that. I suspect it is beyond their technological reach and certainly beyond their conceptual reach. And in the case of Israel, undoubtedly, I suspect their technology is definitely better, but it's clearly beyond their conceptual reach also. A failure of air defense systems on both sides. Of course, in the case of Iran, as far as I can see, all that they're able to do is shoot down a few Iranian drones. Perhaps all of the Israeli missiles get through. In the case of Israel, yes, they do shoot down maybe the majority of Iranian missiles, and I suspect nearly all the Israeli drones, but enough missiles get through to cause damage, and every Iranian missile that the Israelis shoot down, every drone that they shoot down, of course, further depletes their defenses. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I'm not going to return to the subject of air defenses again. It's clear to me that both sides place their main emphasis on their offensive capabilities, their missiles in the case of Iran, their air force in the case of Israel. Both have proved effective. Their air defenses have proved, to put it mildly, they've been found wanting. Anyway, that's what I want to say about this situation in the Middle East. Now, there is the other war that's going on, and it's attracting less attention, but it is the war in Ukraine. And here, by the way, over the last 24 hours, things appear to have taken a major turn. This has actually been true over the course of the whole of the last week. I'm getting the sense that the sands for Ukraine are now definitely running out, and that the Ukrainians are sensing it. Apparently there's a major effort to keep Zelensky away from the new NATO summit, or if not away, to try and rein in what he's going to say. He's, by the way, demanding another $40 billion as I'm making this program, or so I understand. But anyway, Zelensky himself is clearly now himself in growing alarm. You can see this in his statements, from messianic conviction that he was projecting just a few weeks ago, and had done consistently throughout the conflict, at least after the collapse of the Istanbul talks in April 2022. He's now talking and using increasing language of panic, just to say. Anyway, putting all of that aside, putting aside the general picture, we're now starting to get particular specific developments which do look increasingly catastrophic from a Ukrainian point of view. Now, the Russians, over the last couple of days, have been conducting operations in Sumy region. The Ukrainians claim to have recaptured a village of Andreevka. Group of forces north says that is not true. I believe, group of forces north. They have been consistently reliable about these sort of things. Just to say, that's in Sumy region. There are reports that the Russians have made significant advances around Siversk. There are reports that the Russians are advancing further westwards in the Dnipropetrovsk area. Raidovka, the Russian newspaper, says that the Russians are about to begin their attack on the important fortified town of Novopavlivka in Dnipropetrovsk region, which is the last big remaining logistical hub that the Ukrainians supposedly now have in this area of southwest Donbass. All of that is no doubt extremely important, but the main battle continues to be around Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. And my suspicions that the Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka are already in a cauldron, that they have been trapped in the area south of the reservoir, which is located to the south of Konstantinovka. That is now becoming the major consensus amongst most commentators of the war. It seems that the Russians have reached perhaps the western bank of the reservoir, and they're sufficiently close to the eastern bank of the reservoir to make it incredibly difficult and very, very dangerous for Ukrainian troops to retreat through that route. And reports say that there are several thousand Ukrainian troops trapped south of the reservoir. And if so, that would be the biggest cauldron that the Ukrainians have experienced up to now. Several thousand troops puts this on the scale of the entrapment of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol in the first months of the war. Anyway, we shall see, but the reports there are very, very grim and very, 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 very concerning from the Ukrainian point of view. But if possible, there is even greater alarm, and this alarm is now being expressed by the Ukrainians themselves, about the situation northeast of Pokrovsk. The Russians have apparently it is confirmed that southwest of Pokrovsk they've managed to capture the village of Udachnie, and that may very well be true, but it is east and northeast of Pokrovsk that the real disaster is happening. Because I get the sense that the Ukrainian defenses in this area were never particularly strong, that the Ukrainians expected the attack on Pokrovsk to come from the south, and that was where they built most of their defenses. That was, after all, the area where Group of Forces Center appeared to be advancing. The Russians focused, as we all know, they didn't strike at Pokrovsk in the late summer and autumn of 2024. They went for Kurakhovo and Selidovo and Ugledar instead. But I think that the Ukrainians assumed that once they'd finished with those places, they would turn north and attack Pokrovsk and try to attack Pokrovsk from the south. Now, I remember myself saying sometime in the autumn that I thought that before the Russians did that, the Russians would probably want to clean up the villages, capture the villages to the east of Pokrovsk, Vozhizhenka and Novoekonomichny first. And well, so it has turned out. Except that the Russians are doing something much more ambitious even than that. They captured Vozhizhenka some weeks ago. They've now apparently captured another village in this area, an important village called Malinivka. They've also captured Mirny. I discussed this recently. But instead of advancing straight eastwards towards Novoekonomichny, they've also advanced northwards, outflanking Pakrovsk from the north, attacking villages like Koptyevo and those. But the reports this morning, and these are Ukrainian reports, appear to suggest that the Russians suddenly conducted an advance eastwards and have now broken into Novoekonomichnye itself, and that fighting is now taking place in the northern areas of this village. And the reports also say that the Ukrainian defense in Novoekonomichnye and in all of these areas, north and northeast of Pakrovsk, is disorganized and weak, and that the Ukrainians might not be able to defend Novoekonomichnye itself for very long. If this is correct, then we could be looking not perhaps exactly at a cauldron in Pakrovsk, but an effective, what the Russians and the Ukrainians refer to as an operational encirclement of Pakrovsk, one where the main roads are in effect cut, and where the Ukrainian garrison is therefore unable to obtain supplies, and where eventually, as happened in Kurakhovo and Selidovo and Ugledar, it is left with no alternative but to withdraw across the fields and the woods under attack from the Russian drones and the Russian infantry and mobile units that will be looking out for them with the intent to kill or capture as many of them as they can. And we may be much closer to this situation than anyone had previously expected. It could be that we might be seeing the battle for Pakrovsk itself begin at some point in the next few days, perhaps a week, perhaps two, and it could be that the battle for Pakrovsk, when it begins, will take much less time than many people imagine. Now, to repeat again, if Pakrovsk falls, most assume that that will seal the fate of Konstantinovka, that the Ukrainians have been depending on control of Pakrovsk to send supplies to Konstantinovka, even from the north. If Pakrovsk falls, it seems to me that the most important town, fortified position if you prefer, holding back the Russians from advancing westwards towards the Dnieper, will have fallen also. I personally think that, contrary to what some, like, say, Big Serge, believe, it is Pakrovsk that will be the major Russian objective within the next couple of weeks, though it is likely that the Russians will begin attacks on Konstantinovka as well. But anyway, one can see two crises for the Ukrainians playing out roughly at the same time, one south of Konstantinovka, one around Pakrovsk, and with everybody focused on the Middle East, with the United States potentially involved in a forever war there, I can't imagine that there'll be much interest or time left in any Western capital to worry much about Ukraine anymore. Well, this is where I finish my program today. We will see what move, if any, the Iranians make, whether these reports that they're blockading the Gulf of Hormuz are true. We'll probably get a sense of the damage that's been done to the enrichment facilities at Fordow and all of these other places. But bear in mind, the IAEA has itself confirmed that Iran's enriched stockpile of uranium is still safe in some secret location. And I've speculated in this program that that could be Russia or China. or perhaps Pakistan or somewhere else. I'm not even going to try and guess any further. But perhaps the main event to look forward to tomorrow, assuming, of course, that we don't already have a blockade of Hormuz, of the Straits of Hormuz underway by then. Perhaps the main event tomorrow will be the meeting between Arakshi and Putin, and obviously we'll have to see what comes from that. Anyway, this finishes my program for today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget that in our shop we're doing a sale of items which are specific to various cities. I, of course, have back home where I have no internet, my London mug, but you should look out for mugs or hats or hoodies or whatever it is reflecting your own city. And well, at the same time, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.